They sent him as a translator. Then he spoke a word that broke a war god. The transport vessel, Mercy's Edge, shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull scarred by 3 years of ferrying personnel to battlefronts that existed beyond the edge of mapped space. Through its reinforced viewports, the galactic war stretched across the void like a constellation of death flashes of weapons fire that could be seen from light years away, debris fields that had once been entire star systems, and the persistent glow of burning worlds that would smolder for centuries to come. Andrew Keller sat in the cargo hold, clutching a torn book wrapped in black cloth like a talisman against the enormity of what lay ahead. Around him, alien warriors checked their weapons with mechanical precision beings whose very existence redefined humanity's understanding of what life could become. Alien soldiers with crystalline exoskeletons that could deflect plasma fire, their faceted surfaces reflecting the ship's emergency lighting in prismatic rainbows of controlled violence. Thorian berserkers whose 4 arms moved in deadly harmony, each limb calibrated for a different aspect of close-quarters combat. Centaurian tacticians whose compound eyes could track 17 different battle scenarios simultaneously, their neural processing capabilities enhanced by biomechanical implants that pulsed with soft blue light. And among them, one human. Skinny quiet, carrying nothing but an ancient linguistics textbook and 43 years of teaching experience in classrooms where the greatest challenge had been maintaining student attention during discussions of extinct grammatical structures. His hands trembled slightly as he held the book, not from fear of death, though that fear certainly existed, but from the terrible responsibility of representing an entire species to beings who measured worth in tactical capabilities and strategic value. The irony would have been perfect material for those sci-fi stories that circulated through the outer colonies, tales of ordinary humans accomplishing extraordinary things through sheer determination and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. But Andrew wasn't thinking about stories. He was thinking about words and the terrible power they could wield when spoken by someone who understood their true meaning. The war that was about to change everything. The docking bay of battlecruiser Eternal Vigil stretched before Andrew like a cathedral dedicated to the art of systematic destruction. Here, where warriors from 17 different species prepared for battles that would determine the fate of organic intelligence throughout the galaxy, the air thrummed with languages that existed beyond human comprehension, battle songs in frequencies that could shatter bone tactical discussions conducted through pheromone releases that painted complex strategies in scent, and the deep harmonic vibrations that served as prayer among species who had weaponized their own biology. Captain Mira stood waiting at the airlock, her alien features sharp enough to cut glass and twice as unforgiving. Her crystalline exoskeleton bore the scars of 17 major engagements, each mark representing battles where she had been the only survivor of her unit. The loss of her family to Creel von Raiders 3 years prior had transformed her from a diplomatic liaison into something approaching a living weapon, her hatred refined to surgical precision. What could be more tragic than defeat? She muttered, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone who had watched too many friends die for strategies that never worked. Command sends us language teachers now. The alien warriors around the docking bay turned their attention to Andrew with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed disgust. A Thorian berserker, his 4 arms armed with plasma cannons that could level city blocks, shook his massive head in disappointment. Humans! He growled in heavily accented standard, his voice like grinding stone. The strangest creatures in the known universe. They survive by telling stories while real warriors die in vacuum. Andrew felt the weight of their judgment like a physical force pressing against his chest. These beings had evolved for warfare, had developed technologies that could reshape matter at the molecular level, had conquered diseases that had plagued their species for millennia. And they saw him as dead weight, another mouth, to feed another body, to protect another complication in a war where every advantage had already been negated by an enemy that seemed to possess infinite adaptability. The book wrapped in black cloth felt heavier in his hands as he followed a maintenance droid through corridors that pulsed with the controlled violence of a warship at battle readiness. The Eternal Vigil represented the pinnacle of coalition military engineering, its hull forged from metals that existed only in the hearts of dying stars, its weapons powered by contained singularities that could crack planets like eggs. But Andrew noticed something that the ship's designers had overlooked: the way the artificial gravity fluctuated in certain sections, the subtle vibrations that suggested structural stress in areas where the original blueprints hadn't accounted for the interaction between different species technologies. Small imperfections, the kind that only someone who had spent decades teaching introductory linguistics to disinterested students would recognize: the places where theory met reality, and discovered that the universe was far messier than any textbook could adequately describe. His quarters were little more than a storage closet with life support barely large enough to contain a single bunk and a small desk. The walls were lined with impact foam designed to protect occupants during combat maneuvers that would reduce unprotected organic matter to paste. It was the kind of accommodation reserved for personnel who weren't expected to survive long enough to require comfort. Andrew set his book on the desk and unwrapped it carefully, revealing pages yellowed with age and marked with handwriting that belonged to a dozen different extinct civilizations. Emotional resonance patterns in pre-industrial linguistic systems had been his father's life work, a comprehensive study of how language could carry meaning that transcended literal translation. The academic community had dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but Andrew had spent his life proving that words possessed power that couldn't be quantified by computational analysis. Through the small viewport, he could see the enemy formations assembling at the edge of sensor range. Creelvan war spheres moved with predatory grace through space, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to mock the geometric precision of coalition vessels. They were beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful, perfectly evolved for a single purpose, terrible and magnificent in their efficiency. The briefing chamber aboard Eternal Vigil represented everything that coalition military doctrine held sacred: technological superiority, expressed through overwhelming analytical capability. Here, holographic displays painted the battlefield in perfect three-dimensional detail, while artificial intelligences processed tactical data at speeds that rendered organic thought obsolete. The room itself existed at the intersection of 17 different scientific disciplines, where the boundaries between physics and warfare had dissolved into streams of pure strategic possibility. Andrew sat in the back corner, ignored by beings whose intellects had been enhanced beyond the boundaries of natural evolution. The Zentaurian fleet commanders communicated through rapid bursts of electromagnetic radiation, their conversation operating on frequencies that could carry more information in a microsecond than human speech could convey in hours. Alien tactical specialists analyzed enemy movement patterns through quantum probability matrices that spanned multiple dimensions. Thorian berserkers used direct neural interfaces to share battle experiences across collective consciousness networks. And in the center of it all, Admiral Kalen Voss stood before a display, showing the Creelvan advance with the calm certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior firepower and advanced technology. Intelligence reports confirm that enemy forces utilize biological communication systems that operate outside conventional electromagnetic spectrums. Voss announced his cybernetic implants glowing as they processed real-time battlefield data. Their coordination appears to be based on emotional resonance patterns that our AIs cannot effectively analyze or counter. Captain Mira's crystalline features hardened. Then we adapt. We've defeated every enemy that has stood against the Coalition through superior strategy and tactical flexibility. Negative, responded the ship's strategic AI, its synthesized voice carrying the weight of computational certainty. Creelvan communication methods appear to be based on biological systems that predate technological civilization. They operate through what ancient texts describe as emotional language, a form of communication that utilizes neurochemical reactions rather than symbolic representation. The silence that followed was broken by a low harmonic that made Andrew's bones vibrate. Through the chamber's speakers, the ship's sensors had detected and recorded a Creelvan transmission, their first communication attempt in 17 years of warfare. The sound was unlike anything in the Coalition's linguistic databases, a deep resonance that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to evolutionary memory. Around the briefing room, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Admiral Voss stumbled backward, his cybernetic implants sparking as they overloaded from attempting to process information that couldn't be reduced to digital data. Centaurian fleet commanders collapsed as their enhanced neural networks failed to cope with sensory input that operated outside technological parameters. Thorian berserkers clutched their heads in agony as their shared consciousness networks crashed under the weight of emotions they had no framework to understand. A medical advisor fell to his knees, blood streaming from his neural interface ports. His voice, when he could speak at all, carried the tremor of someone whose enhanced intelligence had just encountered its fundamental limitation. 12 seconds of exposure, he gasped. Neural hemorrhaging in 93% of augmented personnel. The signal appears to target technological enhancement systems specifically. Through the chaos, Andrew sat quietly in his corner, unaffected by a transmission that had reduced the Coalition's most advanced minds to neurological wreckage. When Admiral Voss, his cybernetics offline, and his expression carrying the vulnerability of someone experiencing unaugmented reality for the first time, asked why Andrew's response carried the mild confusion of someone stating the obvious. That sound, he said, his voice, steady in the briefing room, filled with the groans of beings whose technological superiority had just been rendered useless. Sounds exactly like the school bell from Lincoln Elementary. Third period advanced placement linguistics. I heard it every day for 22 years. Mrs. Henderson used to ring it manually when the automated system failed during thunderstorms. She said the old bells had better resonance patterns, carried meaning, that digital signals couldn't replicate. His eyes focused on something beyond the present moment, remembering a woman who had understood that some things worked better when operated by human hands. The frequency, the harmonic overtones, even the slight variations in timing, they're identical. This isn't advanced alien communication. It's basic emotional resonance, the kind any species develops before they start relying on technological interpretation. The comparison would have been laughable under any other circumstances. The most sophisticated communication system ever encountered by galactic civilization, and it reminded a human school teacher of a bell designed to move children between classes. But in that moment, as enhanced beings struggled to process information that their augmented minds couldn't understand, Andrew's unaugmented human consciousness had just demonstrated something unprecedented. Sometimes the most advanced problems required the simplest solutions. The Coalition's response to the Creel-Von transmission followed predictable patterns established by 43 years of increasingly sophisticated warfare. Admiral Voss, his cybernetic systems restored, but operating at reduced capacity, ordered the deployment of quantum resonance jammers designed to disrupt biological communication networks. Centaurian tactical specialists recalibrated their electromagnetic warfare arrays to target frequencies that theoretical models suggested might interfere with emotional pattern transmissions. Thorian berserkers prepared boarding parties equipped with neural dampening fields that could theoretically suppress any form of consciousness-based communication. The preparations represented the best efforts of military minds that had conquered every challenge through technological advancement and strategic superiority. Unfortunately, they were preparing to fight an enemy that operated outside the boundaries of technological civilization. Andrew watched the preparations from his quarters, his linguistics textbook open to a chapter on pre-industrial emotional communication systems. The pages contained research that the academic community had dismissed as speculative anthropology, but which now seemed to describe exactly what the Coalition faced. His father's handwritten notes filled the margins with observations about civilizations that had developed language not as a tool for conveying information, but as a method of sharing emotional states across biological networks. The attack, when it came, defied every tactical doctrine in the Coalition's strategic databases. Creel-Von warspheres didn't approach through conventional attack vectors, they simply appeared within the Coalition fleet's defensive formations, their organic hulls materializing from what sensors insisted was empty space. But Andrew understood what the instruments couldn't detect. The enemy hadn't used advanced stealth technology to mask their approach. They had used something far simpler and far more effective. They had asked permission to enter. All ships battle stations. Admiral Voss commanded, his voice echoing through comm systems as the Eternal Vigil shuddered under weapons fire that operated on principles that Coalition science couldn't explain. Deploy countermeasures and prepare for... His order was cut off as another Creel-Von transmission filled the communication networks, this one carrying emotional resonance patterns that bypassed technological systems entirely. The sound didn't damage Coalition equipment, it spoke directly to the biological entities operating it, carrying messages that transcended language barriers and touched something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. Around the bridge, enhanced beings struggled to process information that their augmented minds interpreted as critical system failures. But Andrew, watching through security cameras from his quarters, heard something different. The transmission wasn't an attack or a battle cry. It was something that his decades of teaching linguistic patterns had trained him to recognize, even when spoken in frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. It was an ultimatum, but not the kind delivered through threats or demonstrations of force. The Krilvan were offering the Coalition a choice, and they were doing it in the emotional language that connected all conscious beings, regardless of their technological advancement or biological evolution. The choice between understanding and annihilation. Captain Mira appeared at Andrew's quarters as the battle raged around them, her crystalline features reflecting the emergency lighting that bathed the corridor in shades of amber and red. Her expression carried the desperate determination of someone who had watched strategies fail while warriors died, who had seen technological superiority proven inadequate against enemies that operated outside conventional parameters. "The Admiral wants you to translate their ultimatum," she said, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone delivering orders that made no tactical sense. "Command believes you might be able to interpret their communication methods." Andrew looked up from his textbook, his expression carrying the mild surprise of someone being asked to explain something obvious. "I don't need to translate it, Captain. I understood what they said." "Then what are they demanding?" "They're not demanding anything," Andrew replied, closing his book with careful precision. "They're offering something. A chance to remember what we've forgotten." Through the viewport, Krilvan war spheres moved through the Coalition fleet like predators, among prey their weapons carving through advanced shielding systems as if they were constructed from hope and good intentions. But their attacks were surgical precise, destroying weapons and propulsion systems while carefully avoiding life support and crew quarters. They weren't trying to win a battle through superior firepower. They were trying to teach a lesson about the difference between strength and wisdom. "Captain," Andrew said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades recognizing patterns that others missed. "With your permission, I'd like to send a response." Andrew's request to communicate with the Krilvan triggered exactly the kind of response he had expected from a command structure built around technological superiority and strategic doctrine. Admiral Voss, his cybernetic implant still operating at reduced capacity after exposure to emotional resonance patterns, stared at Andrew through the bridge's main view screen with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been challenged by a substitute teacher. "Absolutely not," Voss declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never questioned the supremacy of advanced intelligence over simple human intuition. "Coalition protocol forbids unauthorized communication with hostile forces. We do not negotiate with entities that have killed 17 billion Coalition citizens." But Captain Mira, her crystalline features reflecting the fires that burned throughout the fleet as Krilvan weapons carved through defenses that had protected the sector for decades, found herself confronting something she had never encountered in 17 years of warfare, the possibility that victory might require abandoning every principle she had used to define herself as a soldier. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Conventional tactics have proven ineffective against this enemy. Perhaps it's time to consider unconventional approaches." "Unconventional approaches?" repeated the ship's strategic AI, its synthesized voice, carrying what might have been computational confusion. "Define parameters for tactical innovations outside established military doctrine." The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Coalition believed about warfare and civilization. How do you innovate beyond the boundaries of logic when logic is all you understand? How do you think outside the parameters of technology when technology is the foundation of your existence? How do you communicate with an enemy that operates on principles that your most advanced artificial intelligences can't even recognize, let alone counter? Andrew looked around the bridge, noting the careful way enhanced beings avoided making eye contact with him, the subtle positioning that suggested they considered his presence a potential contamination of their strategic planning process. These warriors had conquered entire star systems through superior firepower and tactical flexibility, but they were helpless against an enemy that fought with weapons they couldn't detect and strategies they couldn't analyze. Admirals, Andrew said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had spent decades explaining complex concepts to people who weren't ready to understand them. I don't need to negotiate with them. I need to remember something for them. Remember something. Voss's cybernetic implants flickered as they attempted to process a concept that didn't exist in any tactical database. Explain. Andrew reached into his jacket and withdrew his father's linguistics textbook, its pages yellowed with age and marked with handwriting that belonged to civilizations that had developed language as a tool for sharing emotional states rather than conveying information. The book represented knowledge that the galactic community had dismissed as obsolete romanticism irrelevant to the practical realities of technological warfare. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon, revealing a diagram that showed how emotional resonance patterns could create direct consciousness-to-consciousness communication channels. The Creelvan aren't fighting a war, Admiral. They're conducting an examination. They want to know if we still remember what it means to be conscious beings, rather than just enhanced processors running tactical programs. His finger traced the ancient symbols on the page patterns that his father had decoded from ruins on 17 different worlds. Every civilization that develops advanced technology faces this test. The ones that pass learn to integrate enhancement with wisdom. The ones that fail. He gestured toward the viewports where the fires of dying ships painted space in shades of orange and red. They get reminded of what they've forgotten. Through the bridge's viewports, they could see Creelvan war spheres moving through the Coalition fleet with predatory grace, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to mock the geometric precision of technological engineering. Their weapons were dismantling the Eternal Vigil's sister ships with surgical efficiency, but their attacks followed patterns that only someone with Andrew's linguistic training could recognize. They were speaking. Each weapon's discharge was a word in a language that connected meaning to action, that transformed warfare from systematic destruction into structured communication. The battle itself was a sentence, and the Coalition's response would determine whether it ended with a period or a question mark. Captain Mira, Andrew said, turning to the only person on the bridge who had ever looked at him without automatic dismissal. I need you to shut down all external communication systems except for a single unmonitored transmission line. No AI oversight, no tactical analysis, no enhancement systems of any kind. That would leave us completely vulnerable to... Admiral Voss began. To what? Andrew interrupted, his voice carrying 43 years of experience, dealing with people who mistook complexity for intelligence. To an enemy that has already demonstrated they can destroy us anytime they choose. Admiral, they're not trying to kill us. They're trying to find out if we're worth saving. The bridge fell silent except for the distant rumble of weapons fire and the steady hum of life support systems that represented the only thing standing between organic consciousness and the infinite hostility of vacuum. Through that silence, Andrew's words carried the weight of knowledge that couldn't be quantified by quantum processors or analyzed by strategic algorithms. Do you have a plan? Mira asked, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who had watched every strategy fail, while warriors died for principles that no longer applied to the reality they faced. Andrew's smile carried the gentle sadness of someone who understood that the most important truths were often the simplest ones, the ones that people spent lifetimes learning to ignore. No, Captain, I have memories, and sometimes memories are the only weapons that matter. The communication line that Captain Mira established for Andrew existed in a technological limbo that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, a direct transmission channel operating without AI oversight, strategic analysis, or any of the enhancement systems that the Coalition had come to regard as essential for interspecies communication. It was by any reasonable measure a return to the kind of primitive direct contact methods that galactic civilization had abandoned centuries ago in favor of sophisticated translation protocols and cultural interpretation algorithms, which was exactly what Andrew needed. He sat alone in the auxiliary communications chamber, surrounded by equipment that represented thousands of years of technological advancement in the service of making communication faster, more efficient, and more precise. But the device he actually used was something far simpler: his own voice speaking into a microphone that converted sound waves into radio transmissions without any computational enhancement or linguistic processing. The first words he spoke were in a language that hadn't been heard in inhabited space for over 3 centuries, the ceremonial death song of the Veltar Empire, a civilization that had achieved perfect harmony between technology and organic consciousness, before vanishing into the deep void between galactic arms. The words carried emotional resonance patterns that his father had spent decades learning to recognize syllables that touched something deeper than conscious thought and connected directly to the evolutionary memory that all sentient species shared. Andrew's father had included it in his research as an example of how emotional resonance could carry meaning that transcended cultural boundaries, but the academic community had dismissed it as speculative anthropology, another example of his romantic tendency to attribute spiritual significance to simple linguistic phenomena. But as Andrew spoke those ancient words, something remarkable occurred throughout the communication networks that connected the Coalition fleet. The response was immediate. Throughout the Coalition fleet, Creel von warspheres stopped their surgical dismantlement of tactical systems and turned their attention toward the eternal vigil with what could only be described as surprise. Their bioluminescent patterns shifted from the aggressive pulses of active warfare to something that resembled the complex harmonies of structured conversation. And then, for the first time in 43 years of galactic warfare, the enemy spoke back. The transmission that reached Andrew through the unmonitored communication channel carried emotional resonance patterns that bypassed conscious thought and touched something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. But, unlike the devastating signals that had overloaded enhanced beings throughout the Coalition, this communication felt like recognition, the kind that occurs when two people who speak different languages suddenly realize they share the same memories. On the bridge, beings whose intellects had been enhanced beyond the boundaries of natural evolution watched their tactical displays with growing amazement. The Creel von fleet, which had been systematically dismantling Coalition defenses for hours, had stopped fighting entirely. Their war spheres now moved in formation patterns that resembled nothing in any military database, but which reminded Admiral Voss, his cybernetic implants, struggling to process information that couldn't be reduced to tactical data of something he had witnessed during his childhood on the agricultural colonies, the way flowers turned to follow the sun across the sky. Status report. Voss requested his voice carrying wonder rather than command authority. Enemy forces have ceased all hostile actions, reported the ship's strategic AI, and for the first time in its operational history, the artificial intelligence's voice carried something approaching confusion. They appear to be listening. What the AI couldn't articulate was something that every organic being on the bridge understood instinctively. The Creelvon weren't just listening to Andrew's words. They were listening to his memories, to the emotional patterns that connected language to lived experience, to the knowledge that could only be shared by beings who understood that consciousness was more than just information processing. In the communication chamber, Andrew continued speaking in languages that predated technological civilization, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of species that had learned to use words not as tools for conveying data, but as bridges between minds that existed in different forms of reality. He spoke of the Anthari philosophers who had achieved immortality through understanding the relationship between memory and meaning. He recited the mathematical poetry of the synthesis movement, where equations had been composed not to solve problems, but to express the emotional truth of existence itself. And as he spoke, something unprecedented occurred throughout the Coalition. Fleet-enhanced beings began to remember what they had been before their augmentation, before their neural interfaces and cybernetic implants had transformed them into living computers optimized for tactical analysis and strategic thinking. For brief moments, they experienced consciousness as it had evolved naturally messy, intuitive, capable of understanding truths that couldn't be quantified or processed by artificial intelligence. The transformation was most visible in Captain Mira, whose crystalline features began to reflect something other than the controlled violence that had defined her since the loss of her family. As Andrew's words carried emotional resonance patterns through the ship's communication systems, she found herself remembering not the tactics that had made her an effective warrior, but the songs her mother had sung during their migration between star systems melodies that had no strategic value, but which had carried the accumulated wisdom of her species across generations of wandering through the void. "He's not translating," she whispered, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. "He's remembering for them. He's showing them that we still carry the knowledge they thought we had forgotten." Through the viewports, the Creelvan war spheres began to change. Their organic hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that resembled the complex harmonies of structured music, and their movement through space took on the flowing grace of beings engaged in communication rather than warfare. They weren't retreating or advancing. They were participating in something that transcended the traditional boundaries between enemy and ally. They were sharing memories with a species they had assumed had lost the ability to remember anything more meaningful than tactical doctrine and strategic objectives. The council chamber aboard the Creelvan flagship Sorozen existed in a space that defied conventional understanding of architecture and engineering. Here, where the species' most ancient warriors gathered to make decisions that would determine the fate of entire civilizations, the walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that recorded the emotional history of every conflict in which their people had participated. The chamber itself was grown, rather than constructed, its organic surfaces shaped by collective consciousness networks that had evolved beyond the need for individual identity. Zarketh stood at the center of this living monument to his species' history, his form towering over communication nodes that connected him to every Creelvan consciousness in the fleet. As the war god of his people, he had led campaigns that spanned centuries, had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had believed themselves superior to biological evolution, had personally overseen the systematic dismantlement of technological societies that had forgotten the fundamental truths of conscious existence. But now, for the first time in his 3,000-year lifespan, he found himself confronting something unprecedented, a technologically enhanced species that had produced a being capable of speaking the emotional language that connected all conscious life in the universe. The transmission from Andrew Keller had resonated through Creelvan consciousness networks with the force of a revelation. Here was a human who understood that communication was more than just information transfer, who recognized that words possessed power that transcended their literal meaning, who had somehow retained the kind of wisdom that most enhanced species lost when they began augmenting their natural capabilities with artificial intelligence and cybernetic enhancement. Analysis: Zarketh requested his voice resonating through biological communication networks that spanned the entire Creelvan fleet. The response came not from artificial intelligence or strategic processors, but from the collective consciousness of his species' most experienced warriors beings, who had participated in conflicts that had shaped the development of galactic civilization for millennia. "The human speaks in the old ways," reported Kethmar, whose consciousness had witnessed the fall of 17 different technological empires. "He carries memories that his species should have forgotten centuries ago when they began enhancing themselves with artificial systems." "More than that," added Velthara, her awareness having tracked the evolutionary development of thousands of different species across multiple galactic arms. "He understands the connection between language and consciousness. He knows that words are not just symbols, but living bridges between minds." Zarketh absorbed this information through neural pathways that had been shaped by millennia of warfare against enemies who had mistaken technological advancement for wisdom. The coalition represented everything his people had learned to recognize as the symptoms of a dying civilization beings, so dependent on artificial enhancement that they had forgotten the fundamental principles of conscious existence societies, so focused on tactical efficiency that they had lost the ability to recognize truth when it stood before them without technological amplification. But Andrew Keller's transmission had revealed something that challenged every assumption the Creelvan had made about enhanced species. Here was a human who possessed technological knowledge, but had chosen not to augment his natural consciousness, who understood advanced linguistic theory, but still spoke from the heart rather than from strategic calculation, who had been sent to a battlefield as a translator, but who was actually serving as something far more important, a reminder of what his species could become if they remembered who they used to be. The decision that faced Zarketh was unprecedented in Creelvan history. For thousands of years, his species had served as a kind of immune system for the galaxy, systematically eliminating civilizations that had become so dependent on technological enhancement that they posed a threat to the natural evolution of consciousness itself. They had perfected the art of warfare, not because they enjoyed violence, but because they had learned that sometimes the only way to preserve life was to eliminate the systems that were preventing it from growing. But the Coalition, despite their dependence on artificial intelligence and cybernetic enhancement, had produced a being who understood the principles that the Creelvan had spent millennia trying to protect. Andrew Keller represented something that Zarketh had believed was extinct among enhanced species. The recognition that consciousness was more than just information processing, that wisdom couldn't be downloaded or upgraded, that the most important truths were often the simplest ones. The war god made his decision with the calm certainty that had characterized every major choice in his 3,000-year existence. He would meet with Andrew Keller personally, without weapons or protective systems, and he would conduct the first peaceful conversation between his species and any enhanced civilization in recorded history. Because sometimes the greatest strength wasn't the willingness to fight, but the wisdom to recognize when fighting was no longer necessary. "Prepare a meeting chamber," Zarketh commanded, his voice carrying through Creelvan consciousness networks with the authority of absolute decision. "I will speak with this human who remembers how to use words as bridges rather than weapons." The request sent ripples of amazement through the collective awareness of his people. A war god requesting peaceful dialogue with a member of an enhanced species was unprecedented, revolutionary, potentially catastrophic to everything the Creelvan had believed about the relationship between technological advancement and conscious evolution. But it was also every being in the fleet realized simultaneously exactly what their species had been waiting centuries to discover: proof that consciousness could survive enhancement, that wisdom could coexist with technology, that the galaxy might not be doomed to choose between advancement and understanding. The meeting between Andrew Keller and Zarketh took place in a chamber that existed at the intersection of biology and architecture, where the walls themselves had been grown to record the emotional history of every significant conversation in Creelvan civilization. Here, surrounded by surfaces that pulsed with bioluminescent memories of treaties and declarations and the kind of communication that transcended species boundaries, two beings who represented fundamentally different approaches to consciousness sat across from each other, without weapons, without enhancement systems, without anything except the words they chose to share. Andrew looked smaller than ever in the organic architecture of the Creelvan flagship, his human frame dwarfed by Zarketh's 3-meter height and the flowing biomechanical extensions that connected the war god to his species' collective consciousness. But his eyes carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent 43 years learning to recognize patterns that others missed, who understood that the most important conversations were often held by the most unlikely participants. "How do you know the old languages?" Zarketh asked, his voice resonating through the chamber's living walls, in frequencies that painted complex emotional patterns across Andrew's consciousness. "Your species has used technological translation systems for centuries. The direct language-to-emotion connection should have been lost when you began augmenting your communication capabilities." Andrew's smile carried the gentle sadness of someone who had watched the academic world dismiss his father's life work as romantic nonsense, who had spent decades teaching in schools where students preferred digital translation to actual learning, who had been sent to a battlefront because command assumed that human consciousness was interchangeable with artificial intelligence. "Because someone has to remember," he replied, his words carrying the emotional resonance patterns that his father had taught him to recognize in the literature of extinct civilizations. "My father spent his life documenting the way consciousness communicates with consciousness, independent of the technological systems we use to enhance it. The Academy dismissed his research as speculative anthropology, but I kept reading his books because I understood something they didn't, which is that knowledge has no expiration date. Truth doesn't become obsolete just because we develop new ways of processing information. The emotional language that connects all conscious beings doesn't disappear when we start using artificial intelligence to analyze it. It just gets buried under layers of technological interpretation that make us forget how to hear it directly." Zarketh absorbed this information through neural pathways that had been shaped by 3,000 years of warfare against civilizations that had made exactly the mistake Andrew was describing. The war god's consciousness connected to collective memory networks that contained the accumulated wisdom of his species. But in this moment, he found himself learning something that couldn't be shared through biological communication systems, The recognition that wisdom could survive technological advancement if beings chose to preserve it. Your species augments their consciousness with artificial systems. Zarketh observed, his voice carrying the weight of judgments that had condemned entire civilizations to systematic dismantlement. How did you avoid losing the ability to communicate in the emotional language that connects all conscious life? Andrew's answer came from 43 years of experience, teaching linguistic patterns to students who preferred computational shortcuts, to actual understanding who believed that artificial intelligence could replace the hard work of learning to recognize meaning in complexity. Because I never forgot that consciousness is not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be shared. You can enhance it with technology, you can amplify it with artificial intelligence, you can process it with quantum computers that operate faster than organic thought. But if you lose the ability to connect directly with another conscious being, if you become so dependent on technological interpretation that you forget how to hear the actual words being spoken, then all your enhancements just become barriers between you and the truth you're trying to understand. Andrew paused, his gaze moving to the living walls that recorded their conversation in patterns of light and memory. My father used to tell me that the most dangerous moment in any species' development is when they convince themselves that wisdom can be downloaded like software updates, when they stop teaching children to listen with their hearts because they assume their neural interfaces can process emotional data more efficiently than natural empathy. The Krielvan have watched 17 civilizations make that mistake. They were testing whether we had made it too. The silence that followed carried the weight of 3,000 years of warfare beginning to end. Through the chamber's living walls, Zarketh could feel the emotional resonance patterns that connected his consciousness to every Krielvan in the fleet, and through them to the collective memory of his entire species. For millennia, they had served as guardians of conscious evolution, eliminating civilizations that had become so dependent on technological enhancement that they threatened the natural development of awareness throughout the galaxy. But Andrew Keller represented something they had believed was extinct proof that consciousness could coexist with technology, that beings could enhance their capabilities without losing their fundamental humanity, that wisdom was not incompatible with advancement. Your species will survive, Zarketh said, finally his words carrying the authority of a decision that would reshape the balance of power throughout known space. But not because of your weapons or your strategic capabilities or your technological advancement. You will survive because you have produced beings who understand that the most important knowledge cannot be downloaded, upgraded, or processed by artificial intelligence. He rose from the organic interface that connected him to the collective consciousness of his people, his movement carrying the fluid grace of someone whose decisions resonated through biological networks that spanned entire fleets. The war god's 3,000-year consciousness had witnessed the rise and fall of 17 different civilizations, had seen species achieve godlike technological capabilities, only to lose the fundamental wisdom that made existence meaningful. But in Andrew Keller, he had discovered something unprecedented, a being who possessed both advanced knowledge and the humility to recognize its limitations, who understood that consciousness was not a problem to be optimized, but an experience to be treasured and shared across the vast loneliness of space. The war is over, he announced, his voice carrying through Krielvan communication systems with the finality of absolute authority. Not through defeat or victory, but through understanding. We have learned that enhanced species can still carry the wisdom we were created to protect. 27 hours later, the Coalition Defense Council convened the first joint session in its history to hear a report from a being who had never been trained in strategic analysis, tactical doctrine, or any of the enhanced decision-making systems that formed the foundation of military command structure. Andrew Keller stood before an assembly of the galaxy's greatest minds, his only credential, the recognition that he had ended a 43-year war through the application of knowledge that every advanced civilization had dismissed as obsolete romanticism. The Krielvan were never trying to destroy us, Andrew explained, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone addressing people who weren't ready to understand concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. They were trying to determine whether we were still capable of growth or whether we had become so dependent on technological enhancement that we posed a threat to the natural evolution of consciousness throughout the galaxy. The revelation transformed galactic civilization's understanding of warfare itself. The conflict that had consumed 3 generations and 17 billion lives hadn't been about territory or resources or strategic advantage. It had been an examination, a test administered by beings whose 3,000-year perspective allowed them to recognize the difference between advancement and wisdom. In the years that followed, the Galactic Strategy Academy established the Andrew Keller Institute for Consciousness Studies, dedicated to preserving and teaching the kind of knowledge that couldn't be quantified by artificial intelligence or processed by quantum computers. The building itself was a masterpiece of intentional simplicity, its clean lines and functional spaces, designed to honor the idea that the most profound truths were often expressed in the clearest language. Students from across the galaxy came to learn not just about emotional resonance patterns and pre-technological communication systems, but about the fundamental relationship between wisdom and understanding that no amount of artificial enhancement could replicate. The curriculum included mandatory courses in unaugmented listening, where students learned to process information without neural interfaces, and memory preservation, where they studied the techniques that beings like Andrew's father had used to maintain knowledge across generations without digital storage. The Institute's library contained not just databanks and holographic records, but physical books, printed materials that carried the accumulated wisdom of species that had learned to balance technological advancement with conscious evolution. Above its entrance, carved in stone that would endure for millennia, stood a simple inscription that summarized the most important lesson of the war. In a universe full of screams, humans are the only creatures that can whisper and make others listen. But perhaps more important than the formal recognition was the fundamental change in how galactic civilization viewed the relationship between consciousness and technology. Universities throughout known space began requiring courses in direct consciousness communication, in the kind of emotional language that connected beings across species boundaries without technological mediation. Students who had previously focused exclusively on artificial enhancement and strategic analysis now learned to recognize the patterns that could only be detected by unaugmented awareness operating on intuition rather than calculation. The war had ended not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the recognition that consciousness was not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be shared. That wisdom was not something that could be upgraded or enhanced, but something that had to be carefully preserved across generations of beings who understood its value. And in the quiet corners of memory, where the most important truths waited patiently for people wise enough to remember them, Andrew Keller's father smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had finally found the recognition it deserved, not from academic institutions or technological systems, but from the universe itself, which had chosen his son to demonstrate that some knowledge was too important to be forgotten, no matter how advanced civilization became. His research, once dismissed as romantic speculation, had become the foundation for a new understanding of consciousness that would guide galactic civilization for millennia to come. If this story resonated with something deep in your consciousness, if it reminded you that the most important truths are often the simplest ones, then you understand why some knowledge can never become obsolete. Share this with someone who believes in the power of words to bridge the gap between different forms of consciousness. Subscribe if you want more SciFi stories that explore what it truly means to be human in a universe where technology has advanced beyond our ability to understand it. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's helping them remember why they became your enemies in the first place. The galaxy may be infinite, but consciousness is what makes it worth exploring.